He is the top 15 quarterbacks heading into week 16 here. So the fantasy season winding down. What a year it's been. And if you made the finals, congratulations to you. But anyway, here's the first quarterback of the week. And who else would it be but Patrick Mahomes? Mahomes with another great fantasy season. It's been for him is Mahomes. And this week he's got a cupcake matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons that give up the first most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And Mahomes last week versus a decent New Orleans Saints defense. He went for 254 passing yards and 3 touchdowns and 37 rushing yards and a 2-point conversion. So Patrick Mahomes, I think it's another big game this week where he gets the 300 to 400 yards in this one back home in Kansas City versus a weak Falcon defense. And I wouldn't be surprised if he has 3 or 4 touchdowns and another great game. Number 2, Aaron Rodgers of the Green Bay Packers. Last week was a down week for Rodgers. The first time he didn't reach 30 fantasy points plus in 6 weeks. Rodgers versus a mediocre Carolina Panther team. He had 143 yards, a touchdown, and 26 rushing yards with a touchdown. But this week versus a Tennessee Titan defense that does give up a bunch of points, I think Rodgers explodes and gets back up over 30 fantasy points in this one. You know he's a stud. He's been a great season once again this year when people starting writing him off after getting drafted by the Green Bay Packers. But Rodgers still at 37 years old. He has it, and this week he's going to have it once again with a huge game. Number 3, Russell Wilson of the Seattle Seahawks. Wilson, he's been struggling the last few weeks. He started off the season on a crazy pace with touchdowns and yards, but Wilson, he's really slowing down now for this Seattle Seahawks team. And this week it don't get any easier versus the Los Angeles Rams that give up the 32nd least fantasy points to quarterbacks. So Russell Wilson, we'll see what he could do. Last week versus a good Washington team, but nothing great. He only had 121 passing yards and a touchdown and an though and 52 yards rushing. But Wilson, he's got to be better. If you made the championship with him after having a poor performance last week, that's pretty good. And this week, I think he bounces back, even versus a tough defense like the Rams. We saw the Jets beat him. I think Wilson can have a good game and put up good numbers. Number 4, Lamar Jackson of the Baltimore Ravens. And Jackson, the last 3 weeks since he came off the COVID list, he's been on a tear, and he's been the early round pick quarterback that you took in the 2nd or the 3rd round of your fantasy leagues, and he's putting up huge numbers as Jackson. Last week versus Jacksonville, 243 passing yards, 3 touchdowns and though with 35 yards rushing and a touchdown. This week it's a decent matchup versus the Giants. I know they got a pretty good front 7 and stuff, but Jackson, the tear he's on of late, and Baltimore trying to fight to get into a playoff spot here, I think Jackson has a big game where he could get for 30 to 35 fantasy points, and he might run wild in this one. So he's the 4th quarterback I got this week. Kyler Murray of the Arizona Cardinals. What a season it's been for Murray. He's only had 3 bad games the whole year. And last week, what a fantasy performance he had was Murray with 41 fantasy points on 406 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and though 29 yards rushing, a rushing touchdown and a fumble loss. And Murray, he's a quarterback. The ball is always in his hands. He can make plays with his legs, and he also could extend plays. And that's what we've been seeing a lot from him lately. And this week versus San Francisco, it's another great matchup for him. And we just saw the Dallas Cowboys rip up this San Francisco defense with a bunch of backups. So I think Murray can have a huge game this week for the Arizona Cardinals and help you win your championship or 3rd place game, whatever you're in. Number Brady of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Brady, he got off to a slow start last week, but after the Bucs coming off a decent win versus the Vikings the previous week, Brady came in versus a weak Atlanta defense, and he did what he does best. He went for 390 yards and 2 touchdowns. And this week, another great matchup Brady has versus the Detroit Lions. It's another indoor game, which is good, and I think Brady, he could throw for similar numbers in this one. And it was good to see Antonio Brown score his first touchdown in a year and a half for Tom Brady and the Bucs. So Brady, I think he has a good game. Watson of the Houston Texans. Watson, another great fantasy season for him. And without his number 1 man and Will Fuller, he's still putting up numbers. And we saw that last week from Watson versus a decent Indianapolis Colts defense where he went for 373 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 25 yards rushing. And this week he's got a great matchup versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Even though I know the Bengals played well versus the Pittsburgh Steelers on Monday Night Football, I think Watson, it don't matter who he versus. This guy's a stud. He puts up big numbers. And this week, once again, I think he'll go for 25 to 30 fantasy points versus Cincinnati. Numbers Josh Allen, Buffalo Bills, what a performance last week for Allen, with 40 fantasy points. He had 359 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 33 rushing yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns versus a decent Denver Bronco defense. And this week at New England, we just saw Tua have a good fantasy day. I think Josh Allen's going to have a good one. I don't think a crazy day like last week, but I think the 30, 35 fantasy points are definitely possible. He's in the zone. This guy, the accuracy and the strength he has on that arm, and he's getting everyone involved. He's thrown the ball to 12 different receivers this year for touchdowns. So Josh Allen, he's been a stud this season, and next year he's going to be up there in the rankings. Drew Brees, the New Orleans Saints, Drew Brees, he came back good, and he looked decent. He was unscathed in that game versus Kansas City. He went for 234 passing yards and 3 touchdowns in an into. With Michael Thomas, who's out for the season, he still had a good game. He's got a good matchup. This is a Christmas game on Friday. There's no Thursday night games this week. So Drew Brees, I think he can have a similar performance, maybe a little more yards and 1 less touchdown versus Minnesota in a game I believe there'll be a shootout there in the Superdome. Justin Herbert of the Los Angeles Chargers. Herbert, he came back last week with a good game finally. After 2 mediocre and bad games, Herbert had 314 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and a rushing touchdown with 15 rushing yards last week versus a weak Vegas Raider defense. This week he's versus a little tougher of a test in the Denver Broncos, even though we just saw Josh Allen have a huge game versus him. But Herbert, I just don't think he's been that great the last few weeks, like I said, until last. And those other quarterbacks, I like them just a little bit better, especially in a situation. Because Herbert, I could see for some reason him only having 10 to 15 fantasy points, and that hurting your chances of winning your matchups. So Justin Herbert, I think he's safe. And I still think he has a decent game. But it also wouldn't surprise me if he has a mediocre to poor Tannehill of the Tennessee Titans. What a fantasy season and a season it's been for Tannehill. And last week he shredded the defense with 273 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 21 rushing yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns. And this week at Green Bay, Tannehill and this Titan offense is going to need more of the same for him to have a great game and for them to win. So Ryan Tannehill, he's been solid, like I said. Those other quarterbacks I like just a little bit better, but you can't go wrong with Tannehill here. And there's some teams that most likely made the finals with him as their quarterback. And this week I still believe he could lead you to victory. Jalen Hurts of the Philadelphia Eagles. Hurts, he's been a fantasy stud since he's been the starter now the last few weeks. And last week he went for a huge fantasy day. 338 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 63 rushing yards, and a rush touchdown versus the Arizona Cardinals. And Hurts this week, it wouldn't surprise me in a cupcake matchup versus the Dallas Cowboys, him having another big game this week is Jalen Hurts. So Dallas, they don't stop anyone. We saw Nick Mullins even have a 20-point fantasy day. So Hurts, I think he has a big game, but still as a rookie and in his 3rd or 4th start, I can't rank him too high this week because we don't know with rookies the inconsistency. But if he explodes for a huge game again over 40 fantasy points, it wouldn't surprise me for Hurts. But Baker Mayfield of the Cleveland Browns, Baker Mayfield, he's been fantasy relevant now the last 3 or 4 weeks, and this week he's got a great matchup versus the New York Jets. The Jets here, they can't stop anyone. I'm shocked last week they beat the Rams, and Baker last week in the same stadium at MetLife, he went for 297 passing yards and 2 touchdowns and 11 rush yards, and I think he could put similar numbers up versus a weak Jet defense. And Baker, him and Jarvis Landry, they've been on the same page now the last few weeks, which is good. Austin Hooper, they're mixing him into the mix in the offense. And Rashard Higgins, he's been pretty decent as well. So I think Baker has a decent game, and you could trust Matt Ryan of the Atlanta Falcons. He was a guy I was ready to drop last week, but then he came back with a huge ball game for 356 passing yards and 3 touchdowns was Ryan. And this week he's got a matchup where he's going to do nothing but throw versus the Kansas City Chiefs. The Falcons, they'll probably be down early in this one. Versus Tampa Bay, they were up in most of that game last week, but he still had to throw. Todd Gurley, he's a non-factor. Raheem Morris said that Ito Smith's the starter over there now in Atlanta. So Ryan and this offense, they're going to be pass happy. Julio Jones, we don't know if he's going to play, but Calvin Ridley and Russell Gage, they've been big parts of this offense, and they're making plays to help Matt Ryan and his fantasy numbers. Ben Roethlisberger of the Pittsburgh Steelers, Big Ben, he's been slumping now the last few weeks, and last week in a matchup I thought he would take advantage of. He had a horrible fantasy day. Only 170 passing yards, a touchdown and an into, and a fumble loss. And this week it don't get any easier versus a tough Indianapolis Colts defense that gives up the 6th least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. So Big Ben, he could go either way in this one, and I just can't trust him that much as a starter. If you have no other options or you're in a 2-quarterback league, then you got to stick with him. With Ben here, I still think he puts up a top 15 performance, but I could see something like 200 yards and 2 touchdowns and 2 windows in this one. The top 15 quarterbacks I'm ranking here heading into Week 16.